The sunlight shone through the thick foliage of the old oaks, casting fanciful shadows on the soft grass. The scent of roasting meat wafted through the air, mixed with the smell of freshly cut grass and the faint, sweet fragrance of flowers. Laughter filled the space like music, natural and carefree. The small park on the outskirts of town seemed to be an island of happiness for the Williams family. James, a 15-year-old with a bright smile and eyes full of life, was spooning chicken wings with marinade, trying to follow his father's instructions. His younger sister was chasing a colorful ball, and his mother was arranging homemade lemonades on a folding table. Their shared conversations were simple but filled with warmth, about school, dreams, plans for the summer. Everything was serene, even perfect. But the perfect days always end too quickly. At the edge of the clearing, where the grass was growing thicker, glimmers of red and blue slowly appeared. It was a flash, so out of place in this pastoral that at first glance it could have been mistaken for a glint of sunlight. James, not noticing that his movements had slowed, glanced toward the road. The police car moved slowly, its metallic sheen absorbing all the light around it. The family didn't notice anything, still laughing. But James felt a strange chill in his chest. "James, where are you?" His father called out to him, not noticing his son's gaze on the approaching car. "It's nothing," he thought, probably just checking out the park. But the feeling that the sun was shining a little less brightly didn't let him go. The Jeep stopped at the far edge of the parking lot. The door opened with a deafening metallic creak that broke the harmony of sound. A policeman stepped out of the car, a tall, massive man in uniform, his face hidden by dark glasses. He stopped, scanning the space like a predator looking for prey. James averted his eyes, feeling something inside him begin to tremble. Maybe it was just his imagination, or just a coincidence, but the uniformed man was already heading in their direction. This day, which started out so serene, had just lost its serenity. The officer's footsteps echoed on the gravel path, his massive boots leaving deep tracks. He walked slowly, with deliberate confidence, as if he knew that his every movement spoke louder than words. In his hands he held a notebook, which he clutched as if it were a weapon. His dark glasses hid his eyes, but the cold half-smile was enough to make it clear that this man had not come to wish them a happy holiday. James felt his palms sweat. He couldn't explain the feeling, but there was something about the man that instilled fear. The policeman didn't look like an officer of the law, but like an executioner who had already passed judgment. James caught his mother's gaze. Her smile became strained, almost tortured, as she looked back at the officer. "Good afternoon, sir. What can we do for you?" Father asked calmly, stepping forward. His voice was confident, but there was a subtle hint of alarm. "What are you doing here?" The officer's voice sounded rough, with a hint of superiority. He looked slowly at the table and the brazier, then turned his gaze to James. "Barbecue, huh? Is this private property?" Dad frowned, trying to figure out where he was going with this. "No, this is a public park, sir. We're not trespassing. It's okay." "Really?" The policeman took a step closer. His massive figure seemed to obscure the light falling on the family. "Are you sure you have a permit? Or do you think you can just come in here and do whatever you want?" The words hit the silence like a stone on glass. My father stood still for a moment, trying to realize what was happening. "Permission?" he asked in surprise. "We didn't even know we needed one. No one here has ever talked about it. Sir, it's just a family barbecue." "Just a family barbecue," the officer repeated mockingly with a subtle shake of his head. His tone was furious, but the family knew not to give in. It could be a fatal mistake. The policeman suddenly pointed his finger at James. "And you, boy." His voice got rougher. "What are you doing here? Too young to be responsible. Or do you think you're allowed to do anything?" James recoiled, not knowing what to say. His mother stepped forward, her eyes burning with a mixture of anger and fear. "He didn't do anything," she said loudly. "We were just resting. This is some kind of misunderstanding." The officer turned to her, his face hard. He interrupted her abruptly, raising his hand. "I'm not talking to you, ma'am. This is your son, isn't it? Then you must teach him that the laws are the same for everyone, even for people like you." Those words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The silence was deafening. James felt dizzy. He wanted to scream, but he couldn't get a word out. "We haven't violated anything," Father repeated, but now his voice trembled. "This is absurd." The officer grinned, opened his notebook, and pretended to write something. It was a theatrical gesture, an act of humiliation, showing that he had complete power. "I'd be careful with my tone if I were you," he said, looking at his father over his glasses. "And maybe put that brazier away before I give you a ticket. If you don't have the money, I can take it as evidence." Her mother covered her mouth with her hand, trying to hold back a sob. James's little sister suddenly clung to her, feeling the tension that was becoming unbearable. James clenched his fists, feeling the anger rising inside. This wasn't just a day in the park. This was a war where they were targeted just because of the color of their skin. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories. Have similar situations happened in your life or in the lives of people you know? How have you dealt with injustice? Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. We continue. The officer stepped closer, leaning toward James's father so that their faces were almost level. His smile stretched into a thin line that was not friendly in the slightest. His eyes, through the mirrored glasses, showed only the cold certainty that he was right. "You know what I think?" He stretched out, looking straight at his father. "I think you're breaking the rules here, and frankly, I don't like it." His father straightened, trying not to be provocative. His voice was firm, but James saw his hand shake. "We're not violating anything. We're here as a family, just enjoying the day. If there is a specific rule we are alleged to have broken, please explain it." The officer grinned and then turned sharply to James, pointing a finger at him. "What about this guy? What was he doing while I was walking here? I think he was throwing trash. Or was it alcohol? Drugs, maybe?" The last word sounded like a punch, cold and merciless. "What?" James exclaimed, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and indignation. "I didn't do anything." Of course," the officer said sarcastically, looking down at James from head to toe, as if assessing every detail. "You know, kid, it makes sense to me. You're just like everyone else." "All of them? What do you mean, all of it?" Her mother intervened, her voice louder and more desperate than she had expected. The officer slowly turned his head in her direction. His gaze was blank, like that of a man who relishes his power. "It's not for you to tell me what to do, ma'am, but since you asked, you think I don't know how it works? People like you always find loopholes. You think the rules aren't for you? That's not what I think. I'm here, and I make the rules." James felt the blood boiling in his veins. He clenched his fists, but his father quickly put a hand on his shoulder, trying to keep him from acting rashly. "No one here threw garbage, drank alcohol, much less use drugs," the father said slowly, emphasizing each word. "You have no right to accuse my son without proof." "No proof?" The officer snorted. "Do you even realize where you are? I am proof. My word is worth more than anything you say. And if I say your guy's a troublemaker here, then he is." These words sounded like a sentence. People began to gather around them, watching the drama unfold. Some were taking pictures on their phones. Others just stood there, not daring to intervene. James could feel their gazes on him, but he felt the officer's shadow over him even more strongly, pressing down on his shoulders. "Sir, we didn't do anything wrong," James finally said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're just trying to scare us." The policeman stepped closer to James. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but there was something icy in that whisper. "You don't know what you're in for, kid. You think you can talk to me like a friend? You think I'm just going to walk away? No, I'm here now. And you know what? I'll dig into anything to make you understand your place." With those words, he picked up the walkie-talkie and muttered something into it, casting a quick glance at James's father. "Reinforcements are on their way," he announced. "We'll find out who's trespassing and who's just wasting my time." The tension became unbearable. James could feel his hands shaking, but he realized that any movement would only make things worse. All they could do now was wait. James's father took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. He took a step forward, shielding his son protectively. His voice was firm, but there was a restrained pain in his tone. He knew that every word he said could either diffuse the situation or escalate it. "Sir, please calm down. We're just a normal family. We're just here to relax. I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. We didn't violate anything. No park rules. Just let us explain." The officer didn't let him finish. His rough, cutting voice overrode his father's every attempt to speak. "Explain?" He grinned, his tone drenched in sarcasm. "You think I want your explanations? You think I'm here to listen to excuses? Number, I'm here to keep order. And if I say you and your family are breaking the rules, you are. Period." "But it isn't," Father insisted, his voice rising slightly, despite his efforts to keep his composure. "We're not guilty of anything. Look for yourself. There's nothing around that could be a violation. We're just enjoying the day." The policeman stepped closer, almost abreast, his massive figure towering over his father. James felt a wave of fear wash over him. The air around him seemed to grow heavier. "Listen to me," the officer said with restraint, but there was a threat in his voice. "If you don't shut up, I'm going to arrest you right here and now. Do you understand that? And your son?" He paused to emphasize each word. "Your son, that insolent teenager, will go to a place where he will be told how to behave. I'm done." The words struck like lightning. James's mother gasped, covering her mouth with her hand, and his younger sister, sensing the tension, began to cry. James stood there, unable to take his eyes off the policeman who literally exuded hatred. His heart was pounding frantically. His mind was empty except for one thought. Why? Why? You can't treat us like this. The mother couldn't take it anymore, her voice tingling with tears. We haven't done anything wrong. We are people like everyone else. Why are you behaving like this? The officer turned to her, his face harder and his voice even more icy. The same kind of people? He almost spat those words. Do you seriously think I don't see that? You're not like everyone else. You're here in this park, but you don't fit in, and I'm the one who decides what's acceptable here. The words sounded like thunder, finally shattering the atmosphere into shards. The crowd around them began to whisper. A few people looked outraged, but no one dared to intervene. James noticed one woman put her phone away in her bag, as if afraid of being blamed for filming. "You can't intimidate us," his father replied sharply, taking another step forward. He tried to muffle the trembling in his voice, but his fear for his family was too strong. "We're not leaving here until you tell us exactly what we've broken." That phrase seemed to blow the officer's mind. His hand reached for the belt where the handcuffs hung. He took a sharp step forward, as if about to grab his father. "Oh, you won't go?" He squinted, the corners of his lips quivering in a vicious grin. "Fine. Then I'll make sure you come down to the station with me. This whole mess of yours is proof of that. And you, boy," he jabbed a finger in James's direction, "you're coming too. Let's see you smile there." The officer's words pierced James like a dagger. His mind was a jumble of humiliation, fear, and helplessness. He was a teenager, only 15 years old. How could he defend himself against such a man who saw him only as an enemy? His eyes filled with tears, but he turned away so no one would notice. He didn't want to cry. He didn't want to be seen as weak, but he was in pain. "Dad," he whispered softly, not looking up, "let's just go, please." His father turned to him, his face expressing so much pain that James felt even worse. He could see his father fighting the urge to protect him, but realized that there was nothing they could do against the officer and his authority. The situation continued to escalate. The officer was already holding the handcuffs in his hands, and the crowd was silent, as if frozen in anticipation of disaster. "Now you, boy, stand up," the officer said sharply, pointing at James. "Arms out, legs wide, and no unnecessary movements. You understand me?" The words hit James like a hammer blow. He froze for a moment, not knowing how to react. His mind tried to find logic in what was happening, but there was none. He was just a teenager standing in the park with his family, and he was being treated like a criminal. "What?" James mumbled quietly, not believing his ears. "Are you deaf?" shouted the officer. "I said stand up, hands in the air, or do you want me to help you understand what it means to obey?" James looked at his father. His eyes searched for support, for an answer, for some sign that this would all be over soon. But there was only fear and powerlessness in his father's eyes. He fought the urge to intervene, knowing it would only make things worse. "My son has done nothing wrong," the mother shouted desperately. Her voice was trembling, but she was furious. "You have no right to treat him like this." "Take her away," the officer said indifferently, not even looking at the woman. "If she doesn't want to be taken away too, she can shut up." The crowd around him began to grow. People stopped, some with interest, others with horror. Some pulled out their phones filming what was happening, but no one interfered. The stares burned into James, making him the object of everyone's attention, as if he were not a person, but something alien, unacceptable. "Boy, I'm not going to tell you again," the officer hissed, his hand already on his holster. "Get up and do as I say." James realized he had no choice. His hand shook as he slowly rose from the grass. His heart was pounding so hard he thought he could hear it. He stood in front of the officer, who looked at him as if he were assessing his prey before the final blow. "Hands in the air," the officer ordered again. "Come on, don't drag it out." James stretched out his arms, feeling the stares of the crowd burning through him. His face flamed with shame. At 15, he stood before the world like a criminal, even though he had done nothing to deserve it. He felt naked, defenseless, as if his whole world had collapsed in an instant. "You look suspicious," the officer said, slowly circling him like a predator studying its prey. "Who knows what you're hiding? People like you always have something illegal to hide." Those words hurt deeper than any physical blows. "People like you." The phrase rang in James's head, making him grit his teeth to keep from crying. He didn't want to give the officer this chance, but his body was betraying him. Tears came to his eyes and he couldn't stop them. "Sir, stop it!" The father took a step forward, but the officer turned around sharply. "One more step, and I'll arrest you for resisting a police officer," he said coldly, not even letting him finish. "I didn't do anything," James muttered, his voice shaking. I didn't do anything." "Shut up," the officer shouted, pulling out a flashlight and running it along the boy's outstretched arms. "You're here because I said so, and you're not going to talk until I say you can talk." James stood, feeling the pressure building on him more and more with each passing second. The crowd didn't interfere. Some whispered, others just watched. Even those who were clearly outraged were doing nothing more than filming on their phones. "You see it all," shouted the mother in the direction of the crowd. "Why don't you say anything? Why won't anyone help?" No one answered. No one approached. Only a few people looked away. "They won't help," the officer said coldly, grinning. "Do you know why? Because they know you're not like them. You don't belong here." James couldn't stand it. He closed his eyes, trying to imagine this not happening. He wanted to be anywhere but here, but reality was relentless. His humiliation was real. His pain was real. And this whole crowd, this officer, it had all become a nightmare he couldn't escape. The policeman stepped closer, his face even harder, as if he were just waiting for the moment to act more aggressively. James stood there, not daring to move, though every cell in his body was screaming to run away. But to where? The officer was too close. His heavy breathing, like a harbinger of trouble, could be felt in the distance. There was no compassion or regret in the man's eyes, only a soulless confidence in his power. "Hands up," he said sharply, and then, without waiting for James to react, he grabbed his wrist. The grip was strong, rough, as if it were not the hand of a teenager, but a thing to be handled without respect. James groaned in pain, but didn't dare break free. "What are you doing?" shrieked the mother. Her voice tore through the air, full of tension. She stepped closer, holding out her arms as if trying to protect her son. "He's just a child. Leave him alone." The officer didn't even turn around. He ignored her screams as if she didn't exist. His fingers dug into James's pockets, pulling out everything. His phone, his wallet, even a folded handkerchief. He threw things to the ground, not caring that they might be damaged. "No wonder," he muttered, emptying the boy's pockets. "People like you always have something suspicious. It's only a matter of time." "What? We?" shouted James, struggling to hold back tears as the officer turned him around sharply, grabbing his shoulder. "I didn't do anything. Why are you treating me like this?" "Shut up," the officer said, shoving the boy so hard that he nearly lost his balance. "Less talking, more obeying. That's the only thing you need to understand." "This is outrageous," my father shouted in desperation, taking a step forward. His face was twisted with pain and anger. "You have no right to treat my son like this." The officer turned around, his eyes gleaming with something resembling mockery. "Oh, I don't have the right?" he said with a sneer. "You think you can dictate to me how to do my job? Maybe you should explain that at the station. Do you want me to take you away, too?" "It's illegal," screamed the mother, her voice breaking with tears. "We know our rights. Your driver's license?" The officer snorted. His tone was drenched in racism and contempt. "Your rights end where my job begins, and I do it so people like you don't feel too free." The crowd froze. No one intervened. No one even tried to object. Their gazes were full of fear, but they were also full of apathy, as if they were looking at something inevitable, like a storm that could not be stopped. James felt his breathing grow heavy. Tears rolled down his cheeks and he couldn't hide them anymore. He was in pain, not only physically but mentally as well. Every word, every gesture of the officer seemed to burn something inside him. He felt humiliated, destroyed. Suddenly, the officer slammed his arm behind his back, making him cry out in pain. It was too much. His body resisted, trying instinctively to break free, but the officer only squeezed his wrist harder, twisting it to the limit. "Now, hold still," he said, leaning in close to James's ear. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but there was nothing human in that whisper. "You'll learn what it means to obey." "Stop!" screamed the mother, her voice breaking into sobs. "It's just a boy. You're hurting him." The officer took a step back, turning James sharply around to face the crowd. His hand continued to hold the teenager like a trophy on display. "Look, everyone," he said loudly, addressing the crowd. "This is what happens when you don't understand how to behave in a public place. This is a lesson for all of you." James closed his eyes. He didn't want to see the officer, the people, or this park anymore. He felt like the world was crumbling around him. Every word the officer said, every action he took, was like knives that continued to wound his soul. "Daddy," he whispered, barely audible, "help me." His voice was weak, trembling, full of despair. His father wanted to rush forward, wanted to tear his son from this man's grasp, but he realized that any attempt would only make things worse. He clenched his fists, his eyes full of tears. He looked at James, his boy, who stood in front of the crowd, humiliated and broken, and could do nothing. Silence hung over the park. Even the birds stopped singing. Time itself seemed frozen in this terrible moment. Let's pause for one more quick pause. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from. Have there been similar cases in your life or in the lives of your acquaintances? How did you handle these situations? Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. We continue. The policeman continued to hold James as if he were a toy, not a person. The teenager's face turned pale, tears streaming down his cheeks, but he couldn't even protest anymore. He just stood there, feeling broken. His mother was sobbing, cradling her youngest daughter. His father was breathing heavily, struggling to contain the anger that was ready to burst out. The crowd remained silent. Some pretended not to notice what was happening. Some filmed, but no one dared to intervene. Suddenly, a new voice cut through the tense silence. "Officer, let that kid go. Right now." The words sounded loud, confident, commanding. All heads turned at the sound, and a man in a strict dark suit with a folder in his hand stepped out of the crowd. His steps were quick, and his gaze was as cold as steel. It was the family's lawyer, the man they had called when this nightmare had barely begun. The policeman froze for a moment, his hand loosening its grip on James's wrist, but he quickly returned to his aggressive manner. His face became stern. He clearly hadn't expected anyone to dare confront him. "And who are you?" he asked sharply, turning to the man. "That's none of your business." "I'm this family's lawyer," he said calmly. not raising his voice, but his tone was threatening. "And I'm here to stop this circus. You're violating their rights, officer. Your every move is being recorded, and I guarantee you will be held accountable for your actions." The policeman smirked, but a shadow of uncertainty flickered in his eyes. He glanced around the crowd, noticing several phones pointed at him. His face darkened, but he didn't let go of James. "You think you can boss me around?" His voice got even louder, rougher. "I'm in charge here, and I decide who breaks the law. That boy was acting suspiciously. It's my right to stop him and check him out." "Suspicious?" repeated the lawyer, taking a step closer. His eyes dug into the officer like a knife. "Do you have evidence, witnesses, or is that just your preconceived notion? Because all I see is a clear abuse of power and racial discrimination." The crowd stirred. People began to whisper, and a few took a step closer, as if they were going to support the lawyer. The policeman tensed, his hand still clutching James's wrist, but he looked less confident now. "It's none of your business," the officer repeated, but his voice grew quieter. This boy," the lawyer interrupted him, raising his voice, "is innocent. He stands here, humiliated and broken, because you thought you had the right to judge him by the color of his skin. You think that's okay? You think you can get away with it?" The policeman released James's hand, but did so with a gesture as if he were dropping something unnecessary. The teenager staggered, but his father picked him up immediately, pulling him to him. His hands were shaking, and he could feel his son's body shuddering with restrained sobs. "There's no violation here," the lawyer continued, his voice hardening. "This family has a right to be here like everyone else, and you, officer, have just proven yourself incapable of handling the authority you've been given." "You know what?" the officer snapped, trying to regain control of the situation. "You can talk all you want, but if these people are so sure of their innocence, let them prove it in court." The lawyer stepped even closer, his face cold and impenetrable. "If you go on, officer, a trial is exactly where you go, but not as a prosecutor, as a defendant. I warn you, your actions are on record, there are witnesses, and this family has a lawyer who is not afraid of you." The words sounded like a challenge the officer could not accept. He clenched his fists, his face turning purple, but he said nothing. The crowd froze, waiting to see what would happen next. Finally, with apparent reluctance, the policeman took a step back, waving his hand. "Get out," he hissed. "All of you." Now. The lawyer looked at the family, then at the crowd. He leaned over to James, who was still standing next to his father, his face pale, his eyes blank. "It's all right, James," the lawyer said quietly. "You're safe now." But those words couldn't heal the wounds immediately. James felt devastated, humiliated, destroyed. He looked at the lawyer, trying to find confirmation in his face that it was really over, but in his heart he knew it was only the first battle. The lawyer, standing in front of the policeman, remained cool, but the tension in the air was building like a thunderstorm. His confident voice and unwavering stance threw the officer off balance. Instead of backing down, however, the officer seemed determined to redouble his aggression to save face in front of the crowd and regain control of the situation. "Do you think you can come here and lecture me?" Coldly threw the officer, stepping forward, his massive figure looming over the lawyer. "This is not the place for your legal games. This boy is suspected of disorderly conduct, and I will act in accordance with the law." The lawyer didn't back down an inch, looking straight into the officer's eyes. His voice remained steady, but every word hit the mark. "Your actions violate the law, officer. You have no evidence. only preconceived notions. You've already humiliated this teenager in front of a crowd, and I guarantee it will be known throughout the city. Your threats will not change reality." The crowd stirred, the tension almost palpable. A few people began to shout words of encouragement to the lawyer, but their voices were drowned out by the officer's loud roar. "Biased assumptions?" His voice was almost a shout. "You have no idea what I deal with every day. People like him are always causing trouble and then pretending to be innocent. Not on my watch. I'll deal with it whether you want me to or not." James felt his heart clench. The officer's words cut like a knife. Men like him. Those words echoed in his head. He knew what they meant, knew that this man only saw him as a skin color, not a person. James stood beside his father, his hands trembling and his face pale. He felt like he was on the edge of a precipice, and any wrong move could lead to disaster. "You're out of line," the lawyer said loudly, without losing his temper. "Your actions have no legal basis. If you continue, this will become a criminal case. It's not a threat, it's a fact." "A threat?" The officer grinned, but fury flashed in his eyes. "You dare accuse me of breaking the law? You know what? I think you're obstructing justice. Maybe we should clear this up at the station." He stepped forward, his hand reaching for the baton. The lawyer didn't back away, but there was a flicker of alarm in his face. James's father raised his hand as if trying to stop a storm. "Please, calm down," he said, his voice sounding pleading. "We don't want a conflict. Just leave us alone." "Leave you alone?" The officer turned to him, his voice filled with contempt. "You think you can dictate terms to me? No, I make the rules here, and if your lawyer thinks his words mean anything, he's wrong." He pulled his baton from its holster and tapped it against his palm, his gesture threatening. James felt the blood rush from his face. His gaze darted between the lawyer, his father, and the officer, but no one could give him a sense of security. Everything that was happening seemed surreal, like a terrifying dream from which it was impossible to wake up. "Officer, if you use force," the lawyer said, his voice hardening, "you won't just lose your job, you're going to end up in jail. Think about the consequences." The policeman stopped, his baton hand frozen in the air. For a moment it seemed that the lawyer had had enough of him, that he would give in after all. But instead, the officer roared, waving his baton at the crowd. "I'm not going to let anyone tell me how to work," he shouted. "All of you standing here, filming this on your phones, thinking you have the right to judge me? And you." He pointed his baton at James. "You think you can walk out of here like nothing happened? No, that's not going to happen." James's mother screamed, her voice full of terror. She rushed forward, but his father held her back, fearing it would only make things worse. The lawyer stood between the officer and James, his face stony. "This is your last chance, officer," he said firmly. "You either stand down now, or I'll make sure you can never wear the uniform again. You want to risk your career for your pride?" These words finally made the officer stop. His face reddened. He was breathing hard, but he slowly lowered his baton. The crowd froze as they watched him take a step back. It was like fighting a bull that suddenly loses interest in its victim. "You're all going to regret this," he said, putting the baton away. "This is not the end." With those words, he turned and headed for his car. The crowd began to applaud the lawyer, but James's family felt no relief. James collapsed to the ground, his legs no longer holding him up. Tears streamed down his face, and he couldn't stop the sobs. His father sat down beside him with his arms around him, and his mother sobbed, tucked into the lawyer's shoulder. It was the end of the scene, but not the end of the pain. Something in them had been broken, and this day would stay with them forever. The policeman, dropping the threat, headed for his car, but the tension did not subside. James's family tried to regain their breath, to feel some relief that the humiliating scene seemed to be over. The feeling was fleeting, however. In the distance came the sound of sirens. Their shriek broke the silence, causing everyone, including the crowd, to turn toward the road. 2 police cars slowly pulled into the parking lot, their blinkers illuminating the park as if announcing that the storm was just beginning. The officer who had threatened James before stopped and, grinning, folded his arms across his chest. His face expressed satisfaction, as if he had called for reinforcements not to do his duty, but to continue his humiliating show. Several officers emerged from the vehicles. Some of them seemed to be supporting their colleague. They pressed their lips together, crossing their arms over their chests, their gazes sliding over James's family with obvious contempt. The others looked more wary. They cast anxious glances at each other, as if realizing that the situation could get out of hand. "What's going on here?" One of the newly arrived officers, a middle-aged man with graying temples, asked loudly. His tone was harsh, but there was a desire to get to the bottom of it. "These people are disturbing the public order," the first officer quickly replied, pointing at James. "This guy was acting suspiciously. I'm sure he's hiding something. We're just checking to make sure everything is in order." The lawyer stepped forward, standing between the policeman and the family. His voice sounded loud and clear like a hammer blow. "That's a lie. Your vetting is nothing but humiliation and abuse of power. These people have done nothing to deserve this treatment. You have not a single piece of evidence, not a single reason to continue this farce." "Oh, is that so?" the first officer said mockingly, his voice shaking with irritation. "You think you can come in here and tell us how to do our jobs? Maybe you want to take over patrolling the streets? Why don't you stop turning this into a circus?" Another officer from the new arrivals intervened. His voice was calmer, but his eyes were hard. "We're here to protect people, not mock them. Unless you have evidence, I suggest we end this conflict right now." These words caused a wave of discontent among the first officer and his supporters. It seemed that the situation could escalate into a conflict even between the police officers themselves. James felt fear engulfing him again. They stood surrounded, as if trapped, with no way out. His mother continued to cry, and his father stood motionless, clenching his fists to keep from snapping. The crowd whispered, some clearly sympathizing with the family, but no one dared to intervene. "Are you accusing them of something?" The officer with the graying temples asked again, his tone even harsher. "Do you have any reason to do so?" "I don't have to explain my actions," the first officer cut off. "They are suspicious, and that's all you need to know." "It's not suspicion, it's bias," the lawyer said loudly, not backing down a step. "It's racism. You don't see people, you see stereotypes. And if you keep this up, I'll make sure everyone knows about it. Your career will be destroyed." The first officer blushed furiously, but before he could say anything, one of his colleagues touched his shoulder. "Would you stop?" he asked quietly, trying not to let the crowd hear his words. This had already gone too far. "Are you with me or with them?" the first officer hissed, his voice filled with menace. But before anyone could respond, a voice came from the crowd. A woman, standing with a telephone in her hands, shouted, "We see everything. You're abusing your power, Leave them alone." Her shout was picked up by others. A few people began shouting indignant words at the officers, and the situation escalated dramatically. It was as if the crowd had awakened, and now even the voice of the policeman was overpowering its rumble. It seemed that the tension had reached a peak, and that it was about to erupt into something uncontrollable. James stood huddled against his father, his eyes full of tears. He felt small and helpless, like a child surrounded by predators. But at the same time he noticed something new. He saw the lawyer and some of the officers not backing down. He saw people in the crowd begin to talk. Perhaps for the first time in this whole nightmare, he felt a tiny spark of hope. The crowd began to grow louder and louder, but inside James' family it was as if everything had stopped. Time stood still, leaving them alone with pain, fear, and powerlessness. The father hugged his son, his arms shaking with suppressed rage. His mother stood beside him, her face wet with tears, and his younger sister clung tightly to her dress, afraid to even move. James couldn't speak. His voice felt like it was stuck somewhere in his throat. He was exhausted. His body, mind, and soul seemed completely drained after this nightmare. The police officers were talking to each other. Some clearly wanted to continue this power play. Others realized that the situation had gone too far. The lawyer, standing in front of the officers, did not back down. His gaze was firm, but his face expressed fatigue. He knew that this conflict was unlikely to end in victory here and now, but his job was to keep this family from suffering even more. "That's it," said one of the officers, who seemed eager to defuse the situation. "We're leaving. Let them go. There's nothing here." The first officer, the one who had started this nightmare, turned sharply toward him. His face was flushed with rage. "Are you serious? They all saw it." He waved his hand at the crowd. "They're laughing at us. We should have followed through." "They're laughing at you," the other policeman said, looking at him coldly. "You've backed yourself into a corner. I don't want to be a part of it." Irritated, the first officer threw his baton to the ground and spit on the grass, turning sharply to his car. His departure was drenched in humiliation, but it was no relief to the family. There was already a deep wound lodged in their hearts. The crowd began to disperse, and finally the park fell into silence again. But for James, the silence was deafening. He felt his legs shaking, and his father picked him up, pulling him against him. "Are you all right, son?" his father whispered, but his voice shook. He knew the answer was obvious. James didn't answer. He stared into the void, his eyes full of tears, but he wasn't crying anymore. He felt devastated, as if a part of his soul was forever in that moment when the officer had grabbed his wrist. He couldn't forget the way people looked at him, like he was something less than human. "We'll take you home," the lawyer said, putting his hand on Father James's shoulder. "But this isn't over. We will not let this go unpunished. We're going to fight it." The family nodded, but no one felt relief. They knew that the fight was just beginning, and they could not escape the pain that would accompany them. The next day, the story of the incident went viral on the internet. The video, shot on witnesses' phones, went viral. People across the city, and then across the country, saw an officer humiliate a 15-year-old just for daring to vacation in a park with his family. Outrage grew like a storm. People gathered at rallies demanding justice. Loud calls for reform and accountability were everywhere. But for James's family, it wasn't enough. They had to live with the memories of how the humiliation had trampled their dignity. James could not go back to school without fear that someone would remind him of what had happened again. His mother couldn't walk past the police in peace. His father spent sleepless nights blaming himself for failing to protect his son. And yet the lawyer kept his word. He took the case to court, where the first officer was dismissed and disbarred. But that was only a small part of the struggle. James's story became a symbol of the injustice experienced by thousands of others. His face appeared on magazine covers. His name became known to everyone who fought for equality and rights. James, standing on the steps in front of the courthouse months later, looked out at the crowd of people who had come to support him. His voice was quiet but confident. It shouldn't happen to others. We have to stop it. Together. His words drew applause, but inside he still felt the weight of his experience. The price of fighting had been too high, but he knew that now he had a purpose, to fight for those who could not fight for themselves, and that gave him the strength to go on, despite everything he had been through. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? Your thoughts and stories are very important to us. We appreciate each and every one of you and your support. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like to help us tell even more meaningful stories. We wish you a good day and peace of mind.